Okay, so first up is something referred to as RADIUS, and that stands for Remote Authentication and Dial-In User Service. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, dial-in user service, who dials in anymore? Well, there are still some parts of the world that do, in fact, dial in, some parts of the US, in fact. However, that's not really what I'm referring to. It's just a name that's kind of stuck. It started out as remote authentication and dial-in user service, but now obviously people are coming in from cable, from fiber, from other mechanisms. So it's not just referring to dial-in, but the concept is the same. All right, so it provides AAA capabilities. And when I say AAA, I mean three things. It provides authentication, and authentication identifies the user and allows or denies access, right? So that's what I talked about before. We're going to identify that user and either allow them or deny them access. And we can also challenge for additional credentials, right? A two-factor authentication, such as a PIN or a rotating code. They may have a key fob or a dongle. All right, and then next, it's going to provide for authorization. And that deals with providing things like the length of time allowed on the network, access control lists or ACLs for various resources, and things along those lines. And then on top of that, we're going to provide accounting. Now, accounting is used for tracking the start and stop time of each session and can be used for billing or perhaps showback to show how long a user was connected to that service. So if we look at this example, we have good old Alice, right? She's referred to as a supplicant. So we're talking about a RADIUS example here, or the technology. We have a supplicant, we have an authenticator, and then an authentication server, or AS. All right, now, and you also see an AD or LDAP server off in the distance here. That is the actual mechanism that's going to pull up the user account and make sure that they're in the system and so forth. All right, so Alice perhaps wants to access a resource, right? She wants to connect to a wireless access point in this example. Well, rather than have each individual wireless access point have her username and credentials, right? There may be dozens within her environment. They simply are configured to point to a RADIUS server. So that way Alice goes to log in, right? The supplicant to the authenticator. The authenticator is simply going to pass through that request to the RADIUS server. The RADIUS server is what provides the authentication. The RADIUS server is going to contact AD or LDAP, depending on how it's configured, and say, does Alice exist? And what are her credentials? Is she allowed access or not? And if so, obviously we'll reply back positively, replies back to the wireless access point, and she's allowed access. So we can further go on, and if we wanted to layer on 802.1x authentication like we talked about before, we can also make sure that Alice's machine can log into that wireless access point as well, right? So we can not just necessarily filter by MAC address or by IP address, we can also filter by account credentials as well. So there has to be a valid account on the network before authentication is granted to that wireless access point.